Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dark Rhiino Security Confidential. This is your host, Manoj Tandon. And today we have another awesome guest. But before I announce him, I want to remind you guys to please hit the like and subscribe button so we can keep bringing you this great content and having fantastic guests. And speaking of guests, our guest today is Darren Mott. Darren is the author of Get Cyber Smart. He has been a former FBI agent. He spent 20 years with them in cyber and counterintelligence investigations, played a key role in strengthening FBI-Russian collaboration on cyber threats, and created the FBI's first program blending counterintelligence and cyber disciplines. Now he owns an investigative and consulting company called Gold Shield Cyber. And he has a master's degree in education and cybersecurity policy. And when he has free time, he hosts 3 podcasts: the CyBUr Guy Podcast, the CyBUr Smart Morning News and Update, and the Tactical Cyber Podcast. I hope I got them all right there, Darren. Forgive me if I messed up one of them.
Now you nailed them. All correct.
Okay. Well, it's an honor to have you here, and I'm looking forward to this because I don't have to do a lot of talking. So,
I want to say thank you, because I usually don't get asked a lot to be on podcasts. I have to find people to be on podcasts. So I appreciate when people say, "Hey, can you come on our podcast?" I'm happy to talk to whomever, however.
I think someone with your background, that's kind of surprising. You might get a lot more invites after this.
I'm a poor advertiser and poor marketer. I'll be honest. I'm trying to do that better, but we'll see how it goes. It's all good.
So let's do a little bit of a background on you. Everybody loves these origin stories, and at some point, someone's going to say, "All right, I think you guys have done enough of these." But there's everybody wants to know, how did this all begin? Or did you wake up and say, "I want to be cyber"?
No, and I will say it's the same first question I ask everybody, because no one gets to where we are at the beginning. We all did something different and somehow fell into this, and in my experience, fell into it some way, into whatever it is our area of our expertise. And I'll be honest, my origin story starts back in 1977. So I'm 58 now, but in 77, I was 11. My mother was a programmer for a bank, and they had this huge honking, internal server that she was programming to do, keep the account straight. And it had a big dot matrix printer, but it had a little screen about, smaller than the size of your iPhone screen. And I was just fascinated by it. And she created like this little game for me to play on. And I kind of fell in love with computers at that point, but ironically didn't move towards computers when I got to college 7 years later, because, and this is a long part of this, I'll make this very quick. I had appendicitis when I was in 9th grade, decided, hey, I'd like to be a doctor. These hospitals are kind of cool. I don't know, kind of weird. So got to college to try to be a doctor. After 2 years, took the MCAT, did poorly, realized I didn't want to do this for 6 more years, and decided not to be a doctor, but stayed in biology. Ultimately did a bunch of different stuff, spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I really wanted to do, and ultimately went back and became a teacher, teaching biology, chemistry, physics in high school. And then
wow.
Yeah. And then in 1998, my wife and I were talking. We had just had my wife was pregnant with our second child, and I was teaching summer school. And we're like, is this what we want to do? Just be teachers? Because she was a teacher as well. And a week and a half later, I applied to the FBI. I had fallen across their website, and they said accepting applications for special agents. And I thought about law enforcement here and there. And, the FBI has a pretty interesting name recognition. They do good marketing for the most part. And so I sent in my application figuring the worst they can say is no. All along though, I was always working with computers in some way, shape or form. I bought my first PC in 1992. It was a Hewlett Packard. And I did a bunch of stuff on that. I was on the initial.
What was that, a 286 box?
If I'm lucky, it was 286. Yeah. And I was on Prodigy, right? I was on Prodigy learning how the internet and the World Wide Web was working at that point. When I was in college, most of my roommates were computer science majors. So they had, it was a digital computer in 1984, 85, which none of it was networked, right? There was no, in 84, 85, there was no internet. They were networked to the school.
Well, there was DARPANet. But
yeah, but college students weren't accessing that at the time. So it was limited access, let's just say.
Yes, it was limited access.
Yeah. So 90, and then at the school, I was kind of like the computer person because I kind of understood how all these things worked. Even the lady who did the technology didn't understand it. And we had this one school had a Windows, I was at two schools, one school had a Windows, one school had a Mac. So I got to learn how to use both of those things. And then when I applied to the FBI, went through the process, and they hired me, partially because I focused a lot on this computer skill set that I had. It was mostly self-learned. It wasn't like I went to college for it. I was kind of learned it myself. And they needed cyber agents because at the time I was assigned to the Charlotte field office in North Carolina, and they were one of only 16 of 56 field offices that had a cyber squad. So I was on one of the original cyber squads in 2000. When I showed up, beginning of 2000, I showed up in Charlotte, put on the cyber squad, which I wanted to be. I wanted to do the cyber stuff and got it, which was great. Ended up in Charlotte, which was great city. And then pretty quickly jumped into the fire because no one kind of knew how to do cyber stuff at the time, especially the FBI surely didn't. I tell a joke in my presentations that at the time, the FBI spelled cyber with an I instead of a Y. So, wow. And there was no, they didn't really do that, but that's the joke. But there was no cyber division yet. It was, the cyber stuff was all kind of passed around to different divisions. And so no one really knew how to handle any of it. And so I got lucky. I got a pretty good source and ended up running a 5-year undercover investigation targeting what at the time was called the where scene. This was these individuals that all over the world that basically took any copyrighted piece of digital material and they broke the encryption or broke whatever and sent it out there for free. Still goes on today. The impact was limited. Now you can just
buy software. I mean, you can break the encryption on Blu-ray. That's trivial. You can break the encryption on
But at the
DVD,
time,
whatever you want.
Yeah. At the time, this is 2001. We're making the argument that this is a $3 billion a year loss to legitimate enterprise, which it was. And we could show stats that people were losing jobs because the companies were losing money and all that kind of stuff. So I created this undercover that no one had done before. And the nice thing for me is at the time, no one knew how to do any of it. And so no one told me no. They're like, yeah, okay, go ahead and do that. So I had my own offsite, which was about 20 miles from the office. I had at the time, it ultimately became a 12 terabyte server farm, which in 2003 is big at the time. And I built it all. None of it was pre-configured. It was all, I went to this one store and they loved me because every couple of months I'd show up with it and buy $10,000 worth of equipment, like hard drives, motherboards, cases, all that kind of stuff. So
12 terabytes. Wow.
And keep in mind, the first terabyte server I created was with 100 gig drives. So there were 100 gig. So there are 10 100 gig drives all rated together, and then they would crash, they would fail. I had mirrored servers that led to the main server so that I could obfuscate where it appeared I was coming from. I was paying $7,000 a month for an AT&T T1 connection into our office. And then ultimately, the nice thing is technology moved quickly because at the end of my time, I was paying $1,500 a month for a DSL line, which served the purpose that what I needed. Because all these bad guys thought that because we told them that we were in Canada, all their stuff would be protected. And they had no way to prove that we were wrong because we got the cable company to obfuscate our trace route. So when you trace routed my IP address to my server farm, the last 3 dots would be blank. They wouldn't say where they actually showed up in a little town in North Carolina near Charlotte. And we would say, well, the reason that those jump is because there's VPN connections that forward us into Canada, and you can't tell what that is. And they were all these guys. I mean, they were criminals. They're not exactly smart criminals, but they're like, okay, that makes sense to us. Let me send all my evidence to you. So ended up doing 2 big I had 2 large takedowns in 2004, 2005, part of a large FBI major case. Ended up arresting people in like 30 different U.S. cities and 7 different other countries across the world who were involved in this organized crime ring, if you will. So we ended up dismantling like 5 or 6 different groups.
And this was all on pirated materials.
All on pirated material. It was a priority back at the time. I mean, that wouldn't be the same today. But at the time it was, or at least we convinced people of it was. And I had my case. There was a case in Washington that was based on records. The RIAA was the victim. The Recording Industry Association of America was the victim. There was a case in California where the victim was the Motion Picture Association of America. Right? So they were dealing with groups that compromised DVDs and all that kind of stuff. And you may say, look, what's the big deal? And sure, 20 years later, you could probably make the argument. But at the time, it was a big deal because of the amount of loss.
Anymore, I mean, do your kids know what a DVD is?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely not. My kids do. My kids are in their mid-20s. They still know, but I think other kids probably don't. So.
Yeah, I mean, anymore, streaming took care of that, right? I mean,
yes,
and that was a whole industry that just failed to adapt to changing times, unfortunately. But for you, it did matter. One question for you on that: how did you guys? Because at the time, there even today is a law in the books that you're allowed to make, if you own the media, you are allowed to make a copy of that media for your personal backup.
Sure. Fair. Yeah, sure. But they weren't doing it for their own personal. They were distributing it to the world. So,
they were Napster before there was a Napster.
Oh, well, no, they were Napster after Napster. Napster was first, showed what you could do, and then these were Napster on steroids. But the thing is, it was a very interesting community because when Windows, let's say Windows 7 came out, and that may have been later, but let's just use as an example. Windows XP, I think, is probably the best example. Windows XP came out, a group breaks the encryption and makes it available to the world. That's the only copy the world has. It's different now, but at the time, it was a very, I don't want to say ethical, but they had these issues where if the group Mage released the Windows XP key so that you could have a free version of Windows XP, no other group was allowed in this community to be able to crack it themselves. So they were the first to try to be the first to market. Again, they made no money off of it. They were causing loss, but they weren't making any money specifically. So if you were the first one to break the DVD on Spider-Man, then everybody who downloaded that copy of Spider-Man was downloading the same exact copy because it belonged to X group. Again, that changed over time, but at the time, that was kind of how it was set up. And they all communicated on IRC and IRC channels, and we had our own IRC channel for our stuff. We actually created different channels for different groups because we actually were looking at 5 or 6 different groups at the same time. So it was interesting, just needless to say.
In all the years, I'd love to get your take on 2 things. What was a smart, if we can use that word, a smart criminal operation that you saw that might have gotten away with it, but they were not, they screwed up? And then what was the dumbest crime you saw, cyber crime wise?
Ooh, that's a rough one, right? So there's a lot of dumb ones. I mean, I will say like the undercover they were all dumb because they would move their material from their home computers. So, I mean, it made it very easy to find them because you just tracked their IP address and it went right to them. It was very easy. So they were all kind of stupid. They would learn afterwards how to do things. But at the time, I mean, no one's using VPNs. They were just logging in from their house. So those would be the dumb ones. As far as the smart ones, and you can argue this is not necessarily cybercrime, but it is cybercrime, but it's run by nation state actors. It is the Chinese are very good at what they do. They are not well. And I will say they're stupid too. We hear a lot about China stealing intellectual property, and they do that all the time.
But they're leaving breadcrumbs in their code, man. I mean, they're telling
absolutely.
you.
Well,
go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was going to say. No, I was going to tell you a stupid one of the ones that were caught was because they were using the infrastructure they used to hack into the companies they were hacking into to buy stuff from Amazon. That they're buying stuff from Amazon, sending it to their home with their name. So, I mean, China's good at what they do, but they have bad operational security too. So it's crazy. It's hard now to really find. Well, I'll tell you what, the ones who are smart, the ones you never hear about, right? Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon. You hear about them, so they're doing something wrong because their information's getting out. But there's plenty that you'd never hear from. There are plenty of hacking groups that are not making the news, that you're not getting CISA reports on. The FBI's not, because they don't know who they are. They don't know what they are, what they're doing, and they're not loud about it. The ransomware groups are loud because they want it to be known that if you get hit with our ransom, you're not going to get your data back unless you pay the ransom. Or we're going to extort you with the data too. And we're going to release that as well. So Lockbit, Alphabet, all those guys, or not Alphabet, but AlphaV, all those guys, they need to be loud about what they do because they need the victims to believe or know that the only way I might get out of this is to pay my ransom. Now, if I have backups, maybe I'm good. There was a report yesterday or 2 days ago that the average time to ransom TTR is about 14 hours now. That's the average. Some of the good ones can do it in 7 to 8 hours. So if they're doing that, they're not getting in the backups. So your backups could still work. If you have backups, most companies don't have them or don't test it,
most of their backups still don't work, though.
Correct.
Darren,
Right.
I mean,
They don't
70, what's the stat on that? 70%, right? 70%.
Right. Yeah, sure. But I mean, if you're happy to be the one lucky one that your backups work, you're good to go. But you're going to be the rarity. Everybody else has got to decide. They have to decide, am I paying the ransom or not? Because, and the FBI will say, don't pay the ransom. There's plenty of entities that will say, don't pay the ransom because all it does is entice them to continue to do more. That's my argument is that's a bad argument simply because you can't get everybody to stop paying the ransom. So let's just stop saying that. So you shouldn't, but we understand if you have to. There was a thing going around a year ago where they were proposing regulations or rules or laws that said, we're going to fine or punish the people that pay the ransom. Well, that's stupid. Crazy. Why would you double punish a victim already? I mean, it is what it is. I mean, there's ways you can make that. You can make it so they have better cybersecurity by using carrots instead of sticks, but everybody wants to use the stick.
Yeah, I mean, imagine at Colonial Pipeline if they had not paid the ransom, right? And they were operationally just shut down.
Well, let's keep in mind
our natural gas prices.
Yeah, but Colonial Pipeline didn't know what they didn't know, right? So it would hit their business office. It didn't hit their distribution and their pumping and all that other stuff. So that could have continued on. They just didn't know any better. So, but you're right. They had to pay the ransom to carry on. It still caused a host of problems, but it is what. But again, here's the argument I make all the time on every podcast. Colonial Pipeline, I'm pretty sure they make money. I'm pretty sure they're not in the poorhouse and not claiming, filing their taxes, hoping to get all the tax breaks. They make plenty of money that they should have the good cybersecurity in place, but they don't. So for a small company, a medium-sized company, how are you doing it? So it's a lesson that no one wants to learn, the lesson that these big companies, I mean, Microsoft, how many times we got to hear about Microsoft? How many times you have to update your Windows once a month because there's 70 vulnerabilities they found. So at least they're updating, right? At least, but again, then who patches if the small ones aren't patching? So I say all the time, find someone to help you at least understand what I like to call the cybers, right? I'm gonna copyright the cybers because no one else uses that term, but I kind of use it because it makes me laugh. Because I always talk about politicians always trying to do the cybers, and they need to stop trying to do it because they don't do it very well. That's again, I'm running into tangential areas here.
You're not going tangential because you summarized almost 160 podcasts. We've had this issue continues. It continues in the enterprise. It continues in the medium business. And I don't see it changing because foundationally, until the owners of these operations actually understand what real cyber risk is and how it comes about, they are going to not invest in it. To them, this is just an insurance. It's disaster avoidance. That's
right. And I reposted a guy's post today on LinkedIn that makes a great point about proactive versus reactive. The average cost of a data breach now is roughly $4 to $5 million. So, let's assume that's going to happen to you in the next 5 years. Everybody's going to get hit at some point if they don't do anything. So are you preparing for that $4 to $5 million a year, or are you paying maybe $100,000 a year for preventative measures? Because if you pay $100,000 over the 5 years, you're only paying $500,000 versus the $4 million or $5 million hit you get in that one instance. I don't think enough companies recognize that because again, cyber's a cost. It's not going to make you money unless you're in cybersecurity. Then it will. But if you're not in cybersecurity, doing the cyber stuff is not going to make you money. It's going to lose you money, but they don't recognize the annual loss expectancy versus the single loss experience or expectancy.
Yeah,
so
they don't. And they are absolutely not bringing in their people and processes into the equation. A lot of people are just throwing tech at the thing, which to me, that's just like, okay, you checked a box that didn't really go anywhere because unless you are really looking at the process and the governance that the tech is supporting, it doesn't matter because I'm just going to walk in the front door. You can have all the bolts you want.
Right. I made a post a week ago that the hackers aren't hacking in, they're logging in.
Yeah.
I mean, put all the EDR on you want. It's good to have it. I understand if you can afford it and you can use it, that's great. But there's now methodologies, bad guys have figured out how to get around the EDR. And most of the time they don't really care because, if they can find the vulnerability, great, they'll find it, exploit it if they can. I mean, how many times we got to talk about Cisco and Palo Alto and Fortinet and all of their devices having vulnerabilities that give you user level access if you configure it right. The bad guys know that. They look for the patching. So when the CVE comes out, they say, okay, what's this vulnerability? How do I then utilize against it? Because I know that at least half of the companies that utilize this technology aren't patching at any time soon. I mean, Move It is the perfect example. I mean, that lasted 6 months and the patch was out in June and November, people were still getting pounded by Move It vulnerabilities. So it's, we talk about education a lot too. Being an educator, I'm trying to now with my own business, try to blend education and cybersecurity because those are my passions, right? How do I teach people to understand this? And that's what I try to do with my podcast is I don't get into the technicals. I can't code. I'm going to be honest with you. I am not a coder. I'm not going to come in and code your network correctly with all your tools. I can't, that's not my thing, but I can understand strategically and tactically, here's the things you should do that will lower your risk. Because all you're going to do, any company should want to do is lower the risk so that when they go to sleep at night, they know they've done pretty much the most that they can do to keep themselves protected. But most don't take the basics and say, okay, where's my problems? I've created a 10-piece risk assessment for like nonprofits and a church I'm working with to say, hey, look, I know you're not doing anything. So I'm going to start with these 10 simple things. I mean, you can use the CIS 18. If you want to go NIST 800-171 and bring in 110 controls, you do that. You do you. That's not my thing. Do these 10 basic things. I know you're not doing them. Let's figure out what you're not doing, and then let's patch that gap system. And then,
dude, I just say, this is a top 3. I can tell you, there's a lot of companies that don't even get that, and big corporations, right? Forget about the little guy. But it brings up a point here. Like, let's take something as simple as patching. And I'd love to get your opinion on it. Mm-hmm. You should, like you said, update in the theoretical world your Microsoft environment whenever Microsoft is releasing those patches. But in a real world, in a medium business, let's say there's a plastics manufacturer. These guys are running antiquated equipment, and the OEM on that equipment they never update anything. Those guys suck at it. I'm just going to call it for what it is. I mean, they're totally, and if you want the latest, then you have to huge capital expenditure to get the latest update. It's unreasonable to expect those guys to be able to then patch those machines that would actually shut down their operation because they couldn't run anymore.
Well, I think not only that, I think they don't know. They don't know what patching they have to do. They're not aware that they don't. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So what do they do? So how do you address, how do you go about addressing that?
So you have to look, I think companies, well, first of all, you need someone in your leadership that at least will take cyber ownership to say, look, here's the worst case scenario if this happens. So that let's use your plastic manufacturing example. Some leader in that organization has to say, okay, let's say we get hit with something. But again, the problem is they don't know what they're going to get hit with. Is it going to be business email compromise? Is it going to be a ransomware? Is it going to be attack against the OT part of the side? And if you bring in OT, that's a whole different conversation altogether than just the IT, right? So your example brings in both IT and OT, operational technology. But you need that leader to say, okay, I recognize that if we go down tomorrow because of pick your poison problem. And again, in all my podcasts, I say the same thing. Understand the threats targeting you so you can assess your risk. Most companies don't understand the threats targeting you. I have a whole pyramid of threats that go from the skip kitties all the way to nation state actors. So depending on if you're a plastics company, if you're providing plastics to national defense, like you're creating the windshields to the F-35 fighter plane, your information is pretty important. So China's probably targeting your company to figure out how do you make the plastic. And then maybe they need to take you down if there's going to be, there's a lot of different mechanisms here, but if you don't understand who's targeting you, you can't protect against it. So some leader has to actually take the time to say, look, there's 2 types of companies in this world. Those that have been hacked, those that have not been hacked yet. Where do you land? And that's a third part that we don't talk about much. Those that are currently hacked that don't know it. That's the third one, but they're part of the first part too. But so you have to look and say, okay, we've been lucky, we've dodged the bullet. Let's keep dodging the bullet by figuring out how to make the bullet go elsewhere. And again, without that leadership, then you're never going to get to that point because no one cares, right? You've talked about it before. No one, small, medium, they don't think about it, they don't care. But that's why, when I started my consulting things, I think I want to talk to companies, say, look, here's what, at a minimum, start with just here's what you need, what you don't know, here's what you don't know and how you can kind of start to address it if you choose to address it. If you don't want to address it, that's the choice you make. You've made that risk assessment. You're taking risk avoidance is the way you're going. And you're hoping, knocking on wood, that nothing ever happens, but eventually something will happen because the bad guys will find you eventually.
Yeah, especially if you're part of a supply chain that is really juicy, right? Like you mentioned, if you're making the windshield to an F-35 or you're a supplier to, I don't know, the NSA in some way, or, you do whatever, you make sights for guns, whatever the case may be, and you might be a gateway into a much larger operation, right? And those guys need to really look at sectioning off their networks in some ways and understanding it. But, the other thing that happens is there's so much jargon. I mean, in the cybersecurity industry, we have more acronyms than the US military, or we're pretty darn close to it. Whether you can just throw them out all day, PAM, MFA, zero trust, edge devices. You just go out there, just talk. Someone that's running a business is going to have their head explode because they're not going to understand what are you talking about, right? How do you is there a place, let's ask the question this way. Is there a place to take something like the MITRE attack framework and say, these are all the TTPs that we are vulnerable to? Okay, because no one is vulnerable to all of it. I mean, there might be threats that someone's not going to exploit. And then say, of these, the bad actors that operate in our sector really use these 3. So if we're going to shore up out of 12, we can't afford to do all 12. We just don't have the money. But do we do these 3? And this is what it'll prevent. Is that a viable approach, or do you think that's even, Darren?
I think so, but I think it still goes back to the basic piece is, do you understand who's targeting you, right? If you're a bank, you should know that criminal organizations are the ones going to target you because they want your money. Nation states aren't necessarily going to target a credit union because they don't necessarily need the money per se. North Korea does, but they do cryptocurrency specifically, not only targeting banks. So that's an exception. But if you don't understand who's hitting you, then how would you even know which ones you need to look at? So again, I think it goes back to the leadership piece. You have to have someone in your organization that's going to lead the cyber piece to say, I recognize this is going to be a problem. So let's start figuring out what are the basics. We start with the basics. You're at nothing. So the MITRE framework is something that's going to be over here, way over, right over here. You got to get these things in place first before you even start talking about, okay, the MITRE attack framework, which pieces of this do we need to worry about? You need to worry about, do I have a baseline for my hardware? Do I have a baseline for my software? Do I have the right password management in place? Do I have access controls correctly? Do I have an incident response plan? Have I tested the incident response plan? Have I educated the employees to understand what the threats are? How do I do that? And then you can worry about, okay, all those things are in place. So we've done a couple of things to get us a little better further down the road. Now we need to go to that medium road. You need to crawl, walk, and run. Let's crawl first. MITRE attack framework's probably in the walking phase. So once you've got to crawling, let's figure out how to walk. Let's take MITRE in and look at that. Okay, which of these pieces are important to us? And that's where most companies are going to have to look in themselves and say, look, no one here can do this. Sure, we have IT guys. IT guys, as you know, are not cyber guys. Cybersecurity guys. They're cyber guys, not cybersecurity guys. I'm so glad
you're
guys.
Saying this and it's not me. So keep
they're
going.
Not, but they need to work together. They need to You have to have an IT person and a cybersecurity person that can work together. All my experience is they fight against each other. I don't get it. I don't understand that. The organization I just came from, all IT, we were the cybersecurity piece. The IT people were pains in my ass because they just didn't want to say, okay, I understand what you're saying. Let's work to fix it. It was like, ooh, this is our network. If you say that, then I have to turn off the guest Wi-Fi, whatever. I mean, pick a problem. But it's not like we were trying to be adversarial, but it seems to be there's always that adversarial piece. But the IT guys should appreciate the cybersecurity folks, and the cybersecurity folks need to appreciate the IT folks, because the IT has to stay up to go so that the cybersecurity people have something to look at, and the IT people need the cybersecurity people to say, look, here's a hole. We need to fix this hole because someone's going to come in from that. But that's my experience. Maybe your mileage may vary there differently, but I think that's
no, it doesn't. And one of the things that a lot of people we work with don't have a CISO, but a lot of these organizations where one does exist, it's still today, a lot of them report into IT, right?
Yeah.
And to me, there is an inherent conflict of interest there.
And I think that the rise of the virtual and the fractional CISO is good, but I don't know if that's a job I would want, because I don't want the risk pushed on me. I would do that for a company, but I'm not taking the risk on. It's still your risk, because I'm going to tell you how to reduce your risk. If you don't listen to my recommendation, that's on you. That's the executive board fault, who said, hey, this guy said we should have done these things. We decided not to do them because I couldn't get my ESPN fantasy football in time. So I had to keep that hole open. So, we just got hacked. We're going to fire him anyway because he didn't protect us like he was supposed to. And that's, I think larger companies are moving away from that model, but small and medium are still trying to figure out how that space works. Because a lot of them can't afford a full-time CISO, and a lot of them don't think they need a part-time one, because they have their IT guy who's going to do the cybersecurity stuff. Then the IT guy is going to tell the leadership, here's the things I think we need to do, and leadership's going, we can't do that, can't afford it, because and then he doesn't have the backup to say, well, here's why you need to do it, because that's not in his skill set.
No, he's a techie.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't know how that affects operations. It gets back to, if you don't have someone in leadership that's going to take ownership of this problem, well, you got an uphill battle.
We all do. But it's job security, right?
Yeah. But I'd like to see the world change a little bit in this regard. And I don't know. And the data's out there. It's all hiding in plain sight. You just go out there and Google it. There's thousands of us out there that have said the same thing, yet the same pattern keeps repeating, just keeps happening. So, of those companies, let me ask another question. To get the FBI's attention, if you've been ransomed, how big does the number have to be?
Good question. Depends on where. That's a great question. Depends on where you are, right? If you're in Mobile, Alabama, you may not need a big ransom for them to come help you, because it's a small office with a very small corporate infrastructure. And so they may want to go do that because they don't have, it's going to be big to them. If you're in New York, that's a different situation, because there's people getting hit with ransomware all day long. So if you don't have a certain threshold value, then they may not even come out to talk to you. So it's going to depend on the office that represents you. Smaller offices will have a lesser threshold than larger offices. But even then, for most ransomware stuff, the FBI will respond simply because there's intelligence in that forensic information that's valuable to understand who's the group doing it, right? And in that case, if they can figure out, okay, this is Lockbit's ransomware tool, right? Lockbit creates the ransomware and then affiliates use it, blah, blah, blah. So they know it's Lockbit, and maybe they have the decryption code to unlock it. The FBI has a full cache of fully accessible decryption codes. Most of them probably don't work anymore, because once they're realized, the bad guys create new ones and it doesn't matter. But there's maybe some that work that you may be able to uncrypt it. So if you have a ransomware attack, certainly go there. The bigger issue, there's a bigger issue than ransomware that most companies don't think about, because the news doesn't talk about it enough, because it's not sexy, and that's business email compromise. It's a much huger issue, much more loss. It's like 29 times loss per year than ransomware. And that is when a bad guy gets into somebody's email, or fictitiously creates an invoice from a vendor and sends it to the company and says, here's my invoice, pay it, blah, blah, blah. Well, most people don't realize, most people will wait if they suffer that loss, like they pay that $100,000 invoice and realize it was wrong, it was fake. they'll like spend a lot of time doing whatever before they actually call the FBI because they're afraid or whatever. However, if you are a victim of a business email compromise and you contact the FBI within like 48 to 72 hours, there's a 70% chance you can get your money back. Most companies don't realize that. There's a method, there's a thing you have to go through with IC3, but they're very quick to the trigger. So if you say, hey, an hour ago, I sent out a $200,000 wire payment, IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, which is basically the cyber portal for the FBI, will work with the local office, and they will 70% of the time or more, depending on the time frame, the money will be reversed. Now, there's aspects to that where you got to understand how the bad guys work. They're doing this to multiple companies, and it all goes into one pot, and then they end up wire transferring it out. But they don't know when it's there, so they'll go look at it periodically and then pull it out. The way that the kill chain works is whoever's the first one to report it, they go to that pot. If the pot has money in it, and you'll get your money back. But if you're like the fourth person and the money's gone, then you may not get the money back. So it depends on it's a whole thing. But all that to be said, if you are a victim of business email compromise, contact the FBI quickly. And I'll add, in addition to that, most businesses need to know who their local FBI contact is, because it's better to know who they are before you have an incident than when you're in the middle of the incident figuring out who do we have to call. Who do we go to?
So how do they pick up the phone and call the FBI?
Yes. Every FBI office has what's called an office or a private sector coordinator. That person's role is to understand the businesses in their area of responsibility. So like I was that for the Birmingham division in Northern Alabama. So I would go out and companies would call and say, hey, can you have someone come talk to us about cyber threats? Can you have someone come talk to us about white collar, whatever they wanted to talk. Most of them want to talk about cyber stuff, right? Because that's the one that everybody knows about, because white collar crime is, you'll get that, but most people wanted to understand the cyber threat. So then I would get to know who that person is. I would document that, for company A, this is the point of contact. So I would know who that is. They would know who I am, because a lot of times we get information that a company in our AOR has been hacked because another 3-letter agency or somebody else has found that information and said, hey, we believe this company is in your AOR. Here's their data that's been stolen. They don't realize they've been hacked. The actor's still in the network. We'll go to the company. If we know a point of contact, we can go to the company and say, hey, here's the situation. But you've already got that relationship. Any company in any place in the country who's listening to me now, you can call the FBI right now, and they will put you in touch with the private sector coordinator to set up a meeting, to have them come out and do an awareness training. It costs you nothing, but then they can get you in touch with, or at least make a contact with someone on the cyber squad, so that when you have a cyber incident, you know who to contact. Do I have time to tell you a quick story about where this went wrong for somebody? You do. So there was a CIO for a company that contacted me out of the blue. Now, this CIO had a friend who knew me personally. The other CIO was part of a group of 5 that I had that were very important companies in the Northern Alabama region. So I would talk to them quarterly and give them information and do presentations like that. So that the other CIO contacts him to, hey, I need somebody at the FBI. He's called Darren. He'll tell you what you need to know. So the CIO calls me and says, hey, I was reached out by this agent. They claim to be from the Birmingham division cyber squad. They want to tell me something about my network. I said, okay, yeah, he is a cyber agent in Birmingham. And if he's calling you, you want to call him back. He's got some information, because I didn't know what the information was. This was new to me. Okay. But I confirmed he was who he said he was. Well, the CIO apparently didn't believe me, because didn't contact the agent back. The supervisor of the cyber squad sent this CIO an email saying, look, we have intelligence that this ransomware group is in your network right now, because we had intelligence seeing it happen. We were watching them move files from here into this company's network. And the supervisor said, here's how you can find the files. Here's how you can remove the files. They are ransomware files. You want to get them off your net system. Well, the CIO didn't believe that email, didn't believe me, didn't believe the original agent, decided to email the special agent in charge of the Birmingham division to confirm that all 3 of us were who we thought we were. Keep in mind, bad guys are in the system already.
Yeah, he's on the clock at this point.
Well, no, CIO emails from their internal email system. So the bad guys saw the email, we assume, between this CIO and the SAC, and they show up the next morning, system's locked up. they got hit with ransomware. So again, didn't have a contact in the FBI. If they'd had the contact, they would have protected themselves, because we would have said, here's the stuff. They could have removed the files and they could have been clear. But again, that's an example why you need to know who your FBI guy is.
I think that advice was worth the price of admission to this episode for sure, which was free. But that's brilliant. I think most companies do not know to do that. That's
right.
That is really awesome. I don't want you to go before you talk about your book. I'd like to tell us a little bit about Get CyBUr Smart. What's the story behind it? And I do want a signed copy, by the way. So.
Sure. Yeah. Just give me your address. I'll be happy to send it to you and Emily. So about a year ago, I said, I have a lot of stories. I have a lot of different anecdotes and stories about victims I've spoken to, people I've spoken to. And so I came up with the idea of, let me put together kind of the basics, right? Again, being an educator, being in cybersecurity, I wanted to bring those two things together. So I put together a bunch of different stories and organize it in a way that provides information. It's basic information, right? When you read the book, you'll say, kid, I do all these things. This makes perfect sense to me. So it's not really made for you. It's made for the people who call you and say, how do I create multi-factor authentication? I don't understand what that is. So there's stuff on, so every chapter starts with a story, but then it goes into a point that the story relates to. So like there's a chapter on protecting your family and at home. So protecting your kids and the elderly. So there's two stories in there about a lady that I helped become a victim of a romance scam. And there's another one where I helped a family protect their son from sextortion. So the stories kind of lead to what those things are. And then there's mechanisms to protecting yourself from that. There's references at the end of every chapter that say, here's more on all of these topics if you want to go to it. One thing I will say, when I wrote it, I had the idea of creating a YouTube channel to do certain videos on parts of it. I have never got around to it. So if you see the book and you go to the YouTube channel, there's nothing there. So I just haven't done that part. I've kind of fallen down on that. But the book I finished, I wrote it myself, published it myself. So there are there's like 17 typos. There's one guy who bought it, who decided to send me an email saying, here's all your typos. I'm like, yeah, well, I can't fix that now. So it is what it is. You won't necessarily notice them if you're reading quickly, but you may see them. It is what it is. And I will say this, let me tell you this. So anybody who's listening to this podcast who would like who would like a free PDF version of the book, if you email me, I will send you a free PDF version.
What is your email?
Darren@goldshieldcyber.com. Or you can find me on LinkedIn too. You can hit me up on LinkedIn if that's easier, but either way. But yeah, Darren@goldshieldcyber.com.
Fantastic. It's been a pleasure having you on. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day, and would love to get you back for part 2. I mean, there's so much about the GRU that I'd love to ask.
FSB. I didn't deal with FSB. I did FSB, SVR. Or no, I didn't deal with SVR. MSB and MVD were the two kind of main ones I had to deal with.
Well, would love to get some insights. So
anytime.
We will definitely get you scheduled back, because there's a lot of people that would be interested about that topic.
Yeah. I remember most of my trips to Russia, even though I was drunk half the time. Sorry.
Thank you so much for doing this, Darren. Really appreciate you. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thanks for having me.